1,000 churches. That's how many congregations comprised the Calvary Chapel movement at its peak in the early 2010s. 1,000 churches across America and around the world, all tracing their origin to one man, Chuck Smith, and one church, Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa. The movement that defined California Christianity, that pioneered contemporary worship, that launched the Jesus movement of the 1970s, seemed unstoppable. Then Chuck Smith died in 2013, and the empire he built began to fall apart. Within a year of his death, major Calvary Chapel churches were leaving the movement. Pastors who'd been Chuck Smith's spiritual sons were distancing themselves from the Calvary name. Theological controversies that Chuck had kept suppressed erupted into public warfare. Financial scandals exposed corruption in churches that claimed to be spirit-led. The unified movement that Chuck held together through force of personality fractured into competing factions fighting over his legacy. A decade after his death, the Calvary Chapel movement is in crisis. Hundreds of churches have left. Attendance at remaining churches has collapsed. The Bible College is struggling. The radio network has shrunk. The missions movement has stalled. Today, we're investigating the Calvary Chapel collapse. What Chuck Smith built, why it's falling apart after his death, what the fights are really about, and what this reveals about personality-driven movements in American Christianity. If you want to understand one of the most dramatic implosions in evangelical history, subscribe now. Because the Calvary Chapel story is a warning about what happens when movements are built around men instead of principles, when unity depends on personality instead of theology, and when succession planning is ignored until it's too late. To understand the collapse, you need to understand what Chuck Smith created. In 1965, Chuck became pastor of Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa, a tiny church of 25 people. Within a decade, it had become one of the largest churches in America with thousands in attendance. Chuck pioneered a model that revolutionized evangelical Christianity. Casual atmosphere instead of formal religion. Contemporary music instead of hymns. Verse-by-verse Bible teaching instead of topical sermons. Come-as-you-are acceptance instead of behavioral requirements. This approach exploded during the Jesus movement of the late 1960s and 70s. Hippies and counterculture youth who'd rejected traditional churches flooded into Calvary Chapel. They encountered biblical teaching without religious baggage, worship that felt authentic instead of performative, and a pastor who loved them without judging them. Chuck baptized thousands in the Pacific Ocean. Concerts at Calvary became legendary. Musicians like Larry Norman, Love Song, and later bands that formed Maranatha Music created Jesus music, which evolved into contemporary Christian music. The movement grew exponentially. Chuck sent out hundreds of young pastors to plant Calvary chapels across the country. He gave them the model, his blessing, and minimal oversight. The churches were independent but networked. Each pastor had autonomy, but they all looked to Chuck as their spiritual father. By the 1990s and 2000s, Calvary Chapel was a major force in American evangelicalism. They ran Bible colleges, radio networks, mission organizations, and music ministries. They were known for solid biblical teaching, spirit-filled worship, and evangelistic zeal. Chuck Smith was revered, not just as a pastor but as a movement founder whose spiritual authority was unquestioned. And that's where the problems began, because everything depended on Chuck. He was the glue holding the movement together. When he died, there was no structure strong enough to replace him. Chuck Smith died of lung cancer on October 3, 2013, at age 86. His death created an immediate leadership vacuum. Unlike denominations with clear governance structures, Calvary Chapel had no centralized authority beyond Chuck. There was no board that governed all the churches, no denominational hierarchy, no clear succession plan. Each Calvary Chapel was independent. The only thing uniting them was relationship with Chuck and voluntary association with the Calvary Chapel name. Chuck's son-in-law, Brian Broderson, took over as senior pastor of Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa, the mother church. But Brian didn't have Chuck's authority. Other major Calvary pastors didn't automatically submit to his leadership. Some respected him. Others resented him. Still others saw his appointment as nepotism rather than God's calling. The Calvary Chapel Association, which existed to loosely coordinate the movement, tried to provide leadership. But it had no real power. Churches could ignore it without consequences. Pastors who'd operated independently under Chuck's loose oversight now operated completely independently. Within months, fractures appeared. Theological disagreements that Chuck had minimized became divisive. Controversies over worship style, Calvinism, spiritual gifts, and eschatology erupted. Different Calvary pastors took different positions, and without Chuck to mediate, the disagreements escalated. Personality conflicts intensified. Pastors who'd competed for Chuck's approval while he was alive now competed for influence over the movement after his death. Some tried to claim they were Chuck's true successors. Others rejected any centralized leadership entirely. And the movement that had seemed so unified under Chuck revealed itself to be a coalition of independent operators held together only by personal loyalty to one man. When that man died, the coalition collapsed. Subscribe now if you're starting to see why this matters, because we need to understand what specifically went wrong and how bad it's gotten. The most visible sign of Calvary's collapse is the departure of major churches. Within years of Chuck's death, some of the largest and most influential Calvary chapels left the movement. Calvary Chapel, Fort Lauderdale, led by Bob Coy, was one of the largest Calvary chapels with 20,000 in attendance. In 2014, Bob Coy resigned amid allegations of moral failure, including adultery and pornography. The church stayed in the Calvary network initially, but later distanced itself from the Calvary name. Attendance collapsed to a fraction of what it had been. Calvary Chapel, Philadelphia, led by Joe Vogt, was another flagship church. After Chuck's death, Joe grew increasingly uncomfortable with directions he saw the movement taking. In 2019, Calvary Philadelphia officially left the Calvary Chapel network and rebranded as a non-denominational church. Joe said the decision was about maintaining independence and avoiding entanglement in controversies he didn't want to be associated with. Several other large Calvary chapels followed similar paths. They removed Calvary from their names. They stopped attending Calvary conferences. They distanced themselves from the movement while maintaining the teaching style and worship approach Chuck had pioneered. The departures weren't just about disagreements. They were about brand protection. As scandals and controversies hit the Calvary movement, some pastors decided association with the Calvary name was a liability rather than an asset. They could keep Chuck's model without keeping the baggage that came with the Calvary label. Each departure weakened the movement further. When flagship churches leave, smaller churches question their own association. The defections created momentum. Once a few major churches left, others felt permission to leave too. The movement that had grown through church planting and association was now shrinking through church departures and disassociation. As the movement fractured, scandals emerged that damaged Calvary's reputation and credibility. The Bob Coy situation at Calvary Fort Lauderdale was the most prominent. Bob had been one of Chuck's golden boys, a megachurch pastor who seemed to embody Calvary's success. When he fell, it shocked the movement. But it got worse. Allegations emerged that church leadership had known about Bob's issues for years, but covered them up. Former staff members claimed they'd reported concerns and been silenced. The church hired an investigation firm, but many felt the process lacked transparency and accountability. Other Calvary pastors faced similar allegations: sexual misconduct, financial impropriety, abuse of authority. In case after case, the pattern was the same. Charismatic pastor builds large church with little oversight. Problems develop. Leadership circles the wagons to protect the pastor. Victims are ignored or silenced. Eventually, the scandal becomes public. The pastor resigns or is removed. The church implodes. The lack of accountability structures in Calvary Chapel created environments where abuse could flourish. Because each church was independent, there was no denominational oversight. Pastors answered to local boards they often controlled. If problems arose, there was no higher authority to intervene. Chuck Smith's model of empowering young pastors and giving them freedom worked when the pastors were healthy and humble. It failed catastrophically when pastors were narcissistic or corrupt. Without checks and balances, bad pastors could build empires accountable to no one. The scandals revealed that Calvary's strength, independence, and pastor-led authority was also its fatal weakness. When pastors failed morally, there was no system to catch them before they caused massive damage. The movement that prided itself on being spirit-led discovered that spiritual language doesn't prevent very carnal problems. Beyond scandals, theological controversy tore the movement apart. Chuck Smith had held together churches with diverse theological views through sheer force of personality. He'd say we agree on the essentials and disagree agreeably on secondary issues. But after his death, the secondary issues became primary battles. The biggest fight was over Calvinism. Chuck was not a Calvinist. He taught a moderate view that emphasized human free will alongside God's sovereignty. Some Calvary pastors agreed with Chuck. Others leaned Calvinist. Still others were strongly reformed in theology. While Chuck lived, the Calvinist pastors stayed quiet out of respect for him. After he died, they became more vocal. Some started teaching Reformed theology from their pulpits. Others invited Reformed speakers to their churches. This infuriated anti-Calvinist Calvary pastors who saw it as betraying Chuck's legacy. The Calvary Chapel Association tried to enforce theological boundaries. They said churches teaching Calvinism couldn't be part of Calvary Chapel. Some Calvinist-leaning churches left voluntarily. Others were pushed out. The fight became bitter and public, with pastors attacking each other online and at conferences. Other theological controversies erupted over worship style, with traditional Calvary pastors opposing contemporary changes over spiritual gifts, with some pastors embracing charismatic practices Chuck had been cautious about, and over eschatology, with disagreements about end-times theology becoming divisive. Each controversy split churches. Some congregations sided with their pastors. Others left for different Calvary chapels or non-Calvary churches. The theological diversity that Chuck had managed through relationship and wisdom became toxic division without his mediating presence. The movement discovered it had no theological center strong enough to hold when personality was removed. The fracturing and scandals led to institutional decline across Calvary Chapel ministries. Calvary Chapel Bible College, which had trained thousands of pastors and missionaries, saw enrollment plummet. In Chuck's era, hundreds of students attended eager to be trained in Calvary's model. After his death, enrollment dropped by more than half. Young people didn't see a thriving movement worth joining. They saw a fractured, scandal-ridden network in decline. Why invest years in training for a movement that's falling apart? The word for today: Chuck Smith's radio ministry that had broadcast his teaching globally struggled after his death. Brian Broderson took over the teaching, but he didn't have Chuck's following. Stations dropped the program. Donations declined. The ministry that had reached millions shrank to a fraction of its former influence. Maranatha Music, the worship label that emerged from Calvary Chapel and shaped contemporary Christian music, faded into irrelevance. The creative energy that had made Calvary a worship innovator dried up. Younger worship leaders looked to Hillsong, Bethel, and Elevation, not Calvary. Calvary Chapel's missions movement, Calvary Chapel Missions, saw support decline as churches left the network or reduced giving. Missionaries who'd been sent out by Calvary churches found themselves without adequate support as their sending churches imploded or disaffiliated. The Calvary Chapel Conference, which had drawn thousands annually, saw attendance collapse. In Chuck's era, the conference was a must-attend event for Calvary pastors. After his death, it became optional, then irrelevant. Many pastors stopped attending entirely. Every institution that had made Calvary Chapel a movement rather than just a network of churches was in decline. The Bible College, the radio ministry, the music label, the missions organization, the conferences, all were shadows of what they'd been under Chuck. This is what happens when institutions are built around personality rather than structure. When the personality is gone, the institutions crumble because they have no foundation beyond the man who created them. Subscribe now if you're understanding the scale of this collapse, because we need to examine what lessons Christians should learn from Calvary's failure. The fundamental problem with Calvary Chapel was that it was built on Chuck Smith's personality rather than biblical church structure. Chuck was gifted, humble in many ways, and genuinely loved by thousands. But the movement made him irreplaceable. Pastors didn't just respect Chuck, they revered him. His teaching was treated as nearly authoritative as Scripture. His approval was the ultimate validation. His model was followed without question. This created a personality cult, even if unintentionally. When you build a movement around a person, you create systemic fragility. If that person fails morally, the movement is discredited. If that person dies, the movement loses its center. If that person is wrong about something, the movement can't correct course without repudiating the founder. Calvary Chapel's dependence on Chuck meant they couldn't survive his absence. There was no succession plan because Chuck was irreplaceable. There was no governance structure because Chuck's word was final. There was no theological accountability because Chuck defined orthodoxy. This isn't unique to Calvary. Many movements make this mistake, building around charismatic founders instead of biblical principles. The lesson is clear. Movements must be built on Christ and Scripture, not on personalities. Leaders will always fail or die. If the movement depends on them, it will fail or die with them. Biblical church structure includes plurality of leadership, accountability, and governance that transcends individuals. Calvary rejected these structures in favor of freedom and empowerment. They gained growth and flexibility. They lost stability and longevity. Calvary Chapel's independence model created an accountability vacuum that enabled scandal and abuse. Each church operated independently with minimal oversight. Pastors built personal empires accountable primarily to boards they controlled. When problems arose, there was no denominational structure to intervene. No one could investigate, discipline, or remove a Calvary pastor except his own board. This worked fine when pastors were healthy. It failed catastrophically when they weren't. The Bob Coy situation illustrates the problem perfectly. He was the senior pastor of a megachurch. He controlled the board. Staff who raised concerns were fired. When allegations of misconduct emerged, there was no outside authority to investigate. The church investigated itself, which satisfied no one. If Calvary had denominational oversight, outside investigators could have stepped in. Victims could have appealed to higher authority. The situation could have been handled with more transparency and justice. But Calvary's independence model made such oversight impossible. This is the trade-off. Independence gives pastors freedom to lead without bureaucratic interference. But it also gives corrupt pastors freedom to abuse without accountability. Calvary chose freedom over accountability. They're now living with the consequences. The lesson for churches is that accountability isn't optional. It's essential. Pastors need oversight from people outside their control. Churches need structures that can discipline leaders who fail. Movements need governance that transcends individual congregations. Without these, abuse is inevitable. Chuck Smith never adequately planned for succession. He led Calvary Chapel for nearly 50 years. He lived into his 80s. He had decades to develop leaders who could take over. Yet when he died, no one was prepared to lead the movement. Brian Broderson took over the mother church, but he wasn't prepared to lead the broader movement. Chuck hadn't positioned him for that role. Other major Calvary pastors had their own churches but no authority over the movement. Chuck hadn't created structures that would allow for transition. This seems to be a pattern with founding pastors. They can't imagine the church without them. They avoid succession planning because it forces them to confront their mortality. They assume God will work it out when the time comes. Then they die and chaos ensues. Healthy succession requires intentionality. Founders must identify and develop multiple potential successors. They must create leadership structures that can function without them. They must transition authority gradually while they're still alive so successors have legitimacy. They must think institutionally about long-term sustainability, not just personally about their current ministry. Chuck did none of this. He remained the central figure until he physically couldn't continue. Then he was gone, and no one could fill his shoes because he'd made the shoes unfillable. The lesson is that leaders must plan for their absence. Movements that depend on founders must become movements that transcend founders. Otherwise, they'll die with the founder. Calvary is dying because Chuck didn't plan for it to survive him. So what remains of the Calvary Chapel movement? There are still hundreds of churches using the Calvary name, though the number shrinks every year. Calvary Chapel Costa Mesa, the mother church, continues under Brian Broderson's leadership, though attendance has declined significantly from Chuck's era. Some regional Calvary networks remain cohesive. Others have fragmented completely. The movement no longer functions as a unified entity. It's a collection of independent churches with shared history but diverging futures. Some predict Calvary Chapel will completely dissolve within 20 years. Churches will continue leaving or dropping the Calvary name until it's historically irrelevant. Others believe a remnant will survive, smaller and less influential but still committed to Chuck's teaching model. What seems certain is that Calvary will never regain the influence it had under Chuck. The movement's peak is in the past. The question now is how quickly and completely the decline continues. For churches still in Calvary, the challenge is whether to rebuild or abandon ship. Can they create governance structures that prevent future scandals? Can they develop theological clarity beyond personality-driven teaching? Can they rebrand in ways that attract new generations? Or is the Calvary brand too damaged, the model too outdated, the movement too fractured? Many pastors are asking these questions. Some are choosing to stay and fight for renewal. Others are leaving to plant fresh churches unburdened by Calvary's baggage. The future is uncertain, but the glory days are over. What should Christians learn from the Calvary Chapel collapse? First, don't build movements around personalities. Build around Christ, Scripture, and biblical church structure. Gifted leaders are blessings, but they're not foundations. Second, accountability isn't oppressive, it's protective. Independence feels spiritual until it enables abuse. Create oversight structures even when they feel unnecessary. Third, succession planning is biblical stewardship. Leaders who don't prepare for transition are failing their people. Fourth, theological clarity matters. Agreeing to disagree works temporarily. Eventually, unresolved theological differences become divisive. Define your convictions clearly. Fifth, institutions need structure beyond personality. Ministries, schools, missions all need governance that transcends founders. Sixth, transparency beats cover up every time. When scandals happen, address them honestly and publicly. Cover-ups always make things worse. Seventh, the health of the movement matters more than the reputation of leaders. Protecting pastors at the expense of victims destroys credibility and dishonors Christ. Eighth, movements must adapt to survive. What worked in the 1970s doesn't necessarily work in the 2020s. Calvary's refusal to evolve beyond Chuck's model accelerated its decline. Ninth, unity requires more than shared history. It requires shared vision, shared values, and shared governance. Calvary had history but not the other elements. 10th, God's work isn't dependent on any human leader or movement. Calvary Chapel did tremendous good for decades. This decline doesn't erase that, but it reminds us that every human institution is temporary. Only Christ's church, the universal body of believers, lasts forever. 1,000 churches at its peak. Hundreds of thousands of people whose lives were changed through Calvary Chapel ministry. Countless pastors trained and sent out. A worship movement that shaped contemporary Christian music. A teaching model that influenced evangelicalism broadly. Chuck Smith built something remarkable. And now, barely a decade after his death, it's falling apart. The Calvary Chapel collapse is a tragedy, but it's also a warning. Every movement built on personality eventually faces the same crisis. The founder ages or fails or dies. What happens next reveals whether the foundation was solid or sand. Calvary's foundation was Chuck. And when Chuck was gone, the structure couldn't stand. This isn't about Chuck being bad. He was gifted and faithful in many ways. This is about the model being flawed. Personality-driven movements are inherently fragile. They can grow explosively, but they collapse catastrophically. The scandals, the departures, the theological wars, the institutional decline, all of it flows from the same source. Calvary was built around a man instead of on the rock. And when the storms came, the house fell. Here's the hard truth. Your church won't last forever. Your denomination won't last forever. Your favorite ministry won't last forever. Every human institution is temporary. The question is whether we build in ways that honor God and serve people for as long as we're given, or whether we build empires to our own glory that collapse when we're gone. Calvary Chapel, at its best, did the former. At its worst, it did the latter. The collapse we're witnessing now is the inevitable result of confusing the two. If this investigation challenged you, convicted you, or opened your eyes to the dangers of personality-driven ministry, subscribe now. Share this with church leaders who need to hear it. The Calvary Chapel story isn't over, but the ending is being written. And so far, it's not the triumphant conclusion Chuck's followers hoped for. It's a cautionary tale about what happens when we build on personalities instead of principles. May we learn from their failure. May we build more wisely. And may we remember that Christ's church is built on Christ alone. Everything else is sinking sand.